I'm Yuri. I've been a UX designer for over 10 years, working at brands at Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. And that's a lot of logos. The band joining us today has way more logos. I'd like to introduce you all to Matt McLaurin. Matt, can you just let us know a little bit about your background? And yeah, floor is yours.
Yeah. My first paycheck in tech was in 8th grade. I was this is 1980, so eons ago. And it was on a Commodore PET, which had 8K of memory. Really, the only thing you could do on it was write programs. There were no design tools, nothing like that. I wanted to make stuff. I wanted to make cool stuff. And when I saw my first computer game, which was like letters moving around on the screen, my mind was blown. It was my first all-nighter. And really spent the first epic of my career in on the code side. A lot of small startups, and eventually wound up at Apple, 1988 through 94 about. Apple is super formative to me, but let me give you the overall shape of things. After Apple, I left and started a small agency, really one of the first interaction design agencies, now totally gone, but grew that for 7 years, sold it off, went through a lot of business stuff, a lot of learning about organization and culture. And from there, once again, as a leading an org, and I said, hey, I got to get my hands dirty again. I challenged myself to find the coolest game design company in the world. That was Cyan, who had made Myst, which was the #1 selling game on the planet in history at that time. Went out and worked with some of the best computer graphics artists I've ever seen in my life. Absolutely incredible. Wound up back in management again very quickly, managing a mixed team of engineers and designers. And then went to Microsoft, where I spent about 8 years, going from IC to director, stints in eBay, running innovation labs and design systems for them. And then I kind of got sucked into this vortex of really hardcore design leadership, running the design team at Nest Labs, then growing a really big design team from 26 to 160 people at Indeed, which was really, really awesome experience for me. Went into Facebook for actually just about a year there. And from there went into Sony, really because it was kind of the job of a lifetime to launch the PlayStation 5. I'm a lifelong gamer. I think that for me, even in UI design, we should always be watching game design because it's just UI design at 60 frames per second. That's a really important thing in the world today. And then from there did kind of the same thing I did when I left my agency, which is like, hey, it's cool and prestigious, and this is a fantastic brand, and the PS5 product I'm totally in love with. But running 120 person org is a certain kind of lifestyle. It's a certain kind of daily work. And so everything around it, amazing. But daily work, different, good. We'll get back to that. But just very recently said, hey, I'm going to go back. There's a team I worked with at Microsoft who I totally loved. Beautiful values, just really agree with my working style. People I've known for now decades. And they, 30 person crew when I left, they're now like 150 person team over in cloud AI. So they have this really cool stuff happening. It's sort of intersection of technology and it's kind of the future of UI. Couldn't resist, and also was really specifically looking for something that was more hands-on. And so went all the way to IC, kind of a nutty move. We can talk about it a little bit more, but yeah, that's the overall shape of things. That brings us to today.
That was very efficient, Matt. Thank you for that. that kind of tease up the next question for you, which is, like that was a lot of companies, and you used the word epics there. Can you talk about the epics in that career arc? Like, when did you make shifts, and what were you feeling when you made those shifts?
Yeah. I think that it always comes with I think, to be honest, always looking at, where am I passionate about? And that's never one thing. There's always like, oh, I could go in this direction, that direction, the other direction. But I'm looking at, hey, generally there's this set of futures over here that are compelling. And when I see there's kind of a divergence between where my role is going and my current company and where that other path may be leading me. That's not always a spur of the moment thing. I think, when I sold my agency and stayed on for 3 years, a year in, I was kind of like, oh, I see what this is going to be. But I made promises and I'm like, I'm going to stay on out of a sense of duty. As I get further into my career and I have more freedom, it's more about very much focused on what is the work, what is the nature of the work? I can tell you at running a very large organization, the nature of the work is back-to-back meetings from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And
Mhm.
the prestige sounds great, all of that, but I like making things. I like making things with my hands. I like making UI very much in particular. And
Mhm.
I like code. Code as a creative tool is to me one of the biggest misses happening in the industry today. Is we've got this weird separation between code and design, which is kind of like trying to separate paint from art. It's like you kind of can't do it. But yeah. So it's that divergence. It's like I see a different future for me. Yeah.
And in another conversation we had, you said something that I loved, which was to make sure that, as you're navigating those things, that you're treating yourself as a company the same way that, the company is, its own thing.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that? Like, how do you treat yourself as a company when you're evaluating roles, and maybe think back to also in your earlier days,
Yeah.
how you did that, as an IC, and,
Yeah.
being an IC again, you're going to have to eventually do it again. But
Yeah.
can you
Well,
speak to
no,
that a little bit?
yeah. I'll talk about an incredibly powerful lesson I learned when I went to start my agency, which is that we're often frustrated in the corporate environment. We're like, I see this thing, it's beautiful. I'm the expert in this space. Everyone knows it. This is totally right. It's got to happen. Why isn't idiotic management getting it? So think of that moment. We all have it on a daily basis.
Hmm.
Why doesn't management get it? It's clearly the right thing to do.
Hmm.
Flip the other side, you're in a busy store, you're looking for like the best snack for the movie, and like you're trying to pick which one you're going to spend your own personal money on. You don't care
Hmm.
that this guy was the world expert in mints, right? You're not going that deep. You're just going, hey, what do I want to spend my money on, and what reason is this product giving me to buy it? Think about your career like that. You can say I'm in some ideal way the best, this, that, or the other. But if you're not communicating that to your customer, who's your boss, and your peers and all of
Exactly.
that, then they're not going to choose you as a product. And I don't mean that to sound, it's not banal. It's not a bad thing. It shouldn't be a bad feeling, but you really should be thinking like what's on your label and what's in your ingredients. And that's where, for me, there was a phase I went through where on my resume, I put 3 ingredients next to every job. I did a little teeny pie chart next to every job, which was what was the design component in this job, what was the technology component in this job, and what was the business component in this job. Because we may call ourselves designers, but if you don't understand technology,
Hmm.
you've probably noticed it's harder to win some arguments. And you can
Yeah.
understand a little or a lot technology. Every bit you learn makes you better as a designer in the tech world. And then business is really just business is a fancy word for who cares, right? Because when you think about I did this cool thing, well, who cares and why do they care? If you don't know those things, then you're kind of rolling the dice, which is okay. We want to leap with our intuition sometimes, but it's really just recognizing that the person on the other side of the table is just as cynical in their purchasing decisions as you are. And so you really have to think about investing in things that really create deep value. For me, those have been code and design, and then business. A couple of years ago, I went and got an MBA, and it transformed me in like a profound way that I didn't expect. I thought it would be like a cool logo to put on my package, but it was like just a big shift in the way I thought about how we build products. Yeah, I'll leave that one there, but that's a really deep topic.
And right on the heels of that, like I think you got a really interesting perspective on what a portfolio is. You've told me that a portfolio isn't necessarily effective as just like a collection of your art, a la academia. I'll stop there. What is
Yeah.
a portfolio to you, and how do you effectively use it to position yourself for your next role?
Yeah, so it's one of my favorite concepts, and it's one that I have in a lot of mentoring discussions with my own team members, which are usually designers. Is hey, think of 2 portfolios. You've got your craft portfolio where you're talking to other designers, and that's awesome. And when we lose craft, all is lost. So
Hmm.
let's just know that we all agree on that. There's another portfolio, which is what do you know about? What are you good at? What are you aware of? Have you even been tracking? And all of those go into basically triggers for other people to know when to bring you in, right? If I'm out
Hmm.
there going off about accessibility all the time, which I try to as much as possible because it's super important, Then when that executive steering committee comes up and like, oh, who should we put on this for accessibility? They're like, oh, Matt, he won't shut up about this. Clearly, he's going to go for it. He's going to bring something extra to this if we do it. So think of your portfolio like that. What are the things that you're into, that you have depth in, that people know about? And like one very conscious decision for me in this most recent transition was, I'm like, oh my God, AI is going crazy. Like the stuff we see, if you haven't been looking at some of the crazy AI demos that are out on the web today, talk about one of my favorite, GPT-3, where you type a sentence and it will then write a paper in your personal style that actually makes sense. So AI is like, it's going to change everything. And I realized I had not been working in that space. I did actually work in that space with a very early AI group at Apple in the 90s. But I'm like, hey, my portfolio is a little low on AI. I want to invest more there. And I want to invest more there by doing some product work, but also doing it in a context where I can bring in my design and I can bring in my code as well. So think of portfolios. What investments are you making? And you're making them with every minute of your day, right? So you're all making one right now by being in this conversation. Yeah.
And one of my favorite tools in a portfolio is the cliche, 2-3 sentences at the very top of your portfolio. I like to tell my mentees that is literally your brand, right? Like once you have your elevator pitch down to those 2 sentences, that is when you know you have your brand. It's not your colors, it's not your logo, it's that pitch. When you make those moves, are you intentional about getting that level of specificity? So like for me, when I went into Alexa, like I actually said that I'm specializing in smart home stuff, like, and IoT. And I just kind of made myself a domain expert before putting it in that line. But that's separate from design. Like I kind of pigeonholed myself temporarily to say like, this is what I'm going to do. How do you position that, especially since you've done it both as kind of like an on the ground IC as well as an executive? Like how do you navigate that?
Yeah. Well, you've touched on a couple of topics there that are all equally interesting. I'll try to give them each a minute. One is like this notion of like a personal mission statement. Sort of the self as corporation almost. And it's a funny thing where I do like my shower design work. Where you're taking a shower and thinking of cool ideas. I work a lot with words. So I do like a lot of decks, as you might imagine. Decks are really, they're almost, my main creative outlet, particularly when I'm running larger teams. And they're, wordsmithing and getting, saying more with fewer words is, I would say my career has hung on words more than anything else, and I think that's true of many of us in tech, but particularly when you get into leadership roles. They tell you in MBA school on day one, that there's kind of these 2 mindsets. There's poets and there's quants. Quants are the guys who are incredibly good with the numbers. Poets are the business leaders. These are both MBAs, remember, masters of business. Poets are the ones who are good at telling a story, creating a narrative, and creating imagery in their audience's minds. And so that's what the mission statement stuff, that all goes to, absolutely. Now, when it comes to like, how do I do my craft portfolio presentation in an interview process? Hyper minimalist. My first slide has one icon and it has, Matt Mac, which is an alias, an email address. I've had it's become kind of a nickname for some groups I'm in. And then I go straight into work. And that really, it's really personal, depends on who you are, where you're at. And part of it is one thing I learned actually in executive presence training, super incredible class at Berkeley in the MBA program, is the notion of a vertical takeoff. Whenever you're presenting, you want an emotional response. If you're graphing the emotional intensity of your audience, you want it to go to 100 on your first slide. And the easy way to do that, and I'll tell you, feel free to use this cheat, put a picture of your child or put a picture of a puppy, because both of those things are things that human beings are hardwired to have an emotional response to. Now, people who have gone through this training will know that that's a cliche if you do one of those. So please don't do one of those, except do one of those, depending on whether it's a safe environment. Once you have emotional activation in your audience, they're then open to your kind of higher level, esoteric craft and ambition and vision things that you want to talk about. Until they have that emotional engagement, their head's somewhere else, and so you have to pull them into the present, into the moment. So anyway, those are 2 interesting points coming out of your question, only peripherally related, but hopefully interesting.
I love that though. It makes a lot of sense because if you go straight into the tech and kind of droning into like very domain specific point of views, you kind of start it from like a droning lecturing kind of point, and like you've already lost them. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. So
Actually,
the
let me
top,
pile on
oh,
one
go
here.
ahead,
This is
go
just
ahead.
a utilitarian thing. I just want to throw this into the gift bag here. Best thing I ever learned about doing presentations is never read. If you're reading anything word for word, you're almost putting yourself and your audience into a trance of I don't care. Everyone knows they could have read it. I never write scripts. I never go off a teleprompter. My coaches hate it, but I don't rehearse. But I do extensively write. I'll write like 15 versions of my deck at different levels of detail, and then I will never read off screen. Okay, let's get on to the meatier stuff though.
I feel like you've easily given me content for 2 more follow-ups, but I'm gonna try. But I'm gonna try to squeeze as much out of this for our crowd as possible. So the topic for today, right, 20 minutes into the call, is vision. So something that I've really admired about what you've done specifically on the PlayStation 5 is you've flipped a lot of paradigms that have been on the product since not even PlayStation 4, but PlayStation 2. So when you let me know that you were open to having this chat, that's what I wanted to talk about, is like, how do you take a really mature product, right? Like a product that hasn't largely changed for 10 years. And, it maybe gets reskinned, maybe it goes from skeuomorphic to flat, and as of today back to skeuomorphic, but like largely the nuts and bolts of the UX, just they're not changing. I want to talk to you about like how have you over your career, spanning Microsoft, PlayStation, Nest, all these cutting edge brands, how do you drive change? So my first question to you is, being that you did kind of reinvent, well, not you specifically, you had a massive team, but how did you drive that change at PlayStation? Like, how did those conversations start, and how did you paint that picture for both your team of whatever 100 designers, but also your partners? How did you bring along the CEO, the engineers on the ground, super crucially? Like, how did you get them to snap to that? Like how did you start that entire process?
Great. Yeah. So much to say here. And I want to say a couple of general things about vision and strategy in particular. So first, a little bit of a funny thing. Generally, like if I come into an org and people are really restless because they're like, there's a lack of vision, there's a lack of strategy. How I usually interpret that, just having been in many different corporate cultures, oh, that means you don't like where management is going. It doesn't mean you don't know. And it doesn't actually mean that you think they don't know. It means you just don't like it. And that's okay, right? Now that's kind of, it's a bit of a flippant joke, because actually strategy and vision are incredibly deep topics, but people mean very different things when they use those words in the context. So I always look for those. So generally, I'll often do a lot of vision and strategy things without using either of those words, because it is such a mixed up, jumbled kind of political concept. That said, how do we do it? Because you fail without it, right? And I think there's 2 really, really important lenses. There's an individual lens and there's a leadership lens. As someone who has now twice really reset my career from leadership back to individual, it's because I really love what happens at the individual level, because that is where 99.99% of your vision actually comes from, right? It's the closer you are to the work, the closer you are to the interesting core problems of the work, the clearer vision you will have. It's more where vision really suffers is when you're looking in the wrong place. It's like the spotlight's not pointing in the right place. So you can be off in the weeds of the product and like, oh, these aren't the core problems. There are often some like really beautiful, really central problems that everyone will agree are, and the people who are closest to those problems get to develop transformative vision. Because you don't want just, oh, I know where we're going, I have 20/20 vision. That's great. Where we're going is boring and it sucks. So vision might not be the problem here, right? Or it's, but in terms of like, at the IC level, the happiest moments in my entire career have been like, holy shit, like I cracked this problem, and it's a problem that matters, because we have lots of those satisfying moments of I totally solved this thing, but it's off on the edge of our business and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So having been in like these really kind of privileged IC roles, like, when I was at Microsoft for my first go round, all the resources in the world, I think I got 60 patents when I was at Microsoft. Part of it was because I had the incredible support you need to do that depth of work. But this leads to an attitude in me that, it's a little bit anti-management. It's just like, hey,
Mhm.
you guys get out of our way because you're off there within the spreadsheets and we're here grappling with the nature of reality. So respect that we do that. So when I come into a situation like PlayStation, I'm not like, oh, look, a blank canvas I can write on. I'm like,
Mhm.
where are the visions happening in the company today, in the firm, and how do I connect those dots? And so for me, I came in for the last year and a half of PS5 before it shipped. It's funny, the ship dates for a couple of weeks were going to be on my birthday, but I missed it by about a week. But some of the most important things I think that I personally did, because I'm coming in, I have like 100-person org. People are, as they are, tend to be in large organizations. There are little battles going on. There are competing visions. And so the really, really critical for me coming into that is harvesting the vision. It's not like, oh, let me go and inject it. Because we've always done that. And I come in. I get into PlayStation because, certainly for Nishina-san, who's my boss, he needed to see vision coming in that transcendent kind of sense that we mean it. So I clearly demonstrated, I'm like, hey, since I don't know anything, let me tell you exactly what I would do with PS5 today. That was my portfolio presentation. Having won that match, now I get to like go do it. But I realized, hey, there's probably like real diamonds here right now. And it's my job to find them, not to invent new ones, not because I can't, I'm actually really good at it. But because if I spend my time creating like one of the 3 diamonds we need to ship right now, I may drop the other 2 through, onto the street and doing that. So for me, day one was like an incredibly intense sense of I have to figure out who's right really fast.
How do you do that? How do you
um,
identify who's right? I mean, you've got a
yeah,
massive staff, you've
yeah,
got tons of partners, and like if you even just had a single one-on-one with them,
right.
sequentially, that would be your year, right? So like,
That's right.
how do
Yeah,
you how do you efficiently find
yeah.
those diamonds?
Yeah, well, one thing I told Nishina-san, when I first meeting, after I joined, was, oh my God, I love this job because it's using every cylinder I have. Having moved from these weird things from engineer to agency leadership to design roles and all that, I often feel like half of me is left behind. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, awesome design, but I can't code, or like I'm coding like
Yeah.
crazy, but it's not an interesting design problem. And I'm like, this is like the first job I've ever had that was in this level of intensity that calls on absolutely every skill I have, and then some.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, a lot of it is you sit down in these meetings and like you have to decide who you agree with within an hour of meeting them. Or decide,
Mm.
and not just who you agree with, but pick winners. You're going around
Oh,
picking
so
winners.
you're actually prospecting inside of meetings to prioritize, like, okay, I
Yeah,
like that person I think might be on to something.
that's right. Yeah,
That
yeah,
person is status quo. We don't need to meet.
yeah, yeah. And I'll give you the real talk because this is the nature of this kind of thing. Within the first 2 weeks, there was a very senior person on my team who I had told, like, I'm not doing what you're thinking. Like, we're not going in that direction. Now, there was 90 other things that he was doing that, like, absolutely love it. We're going ahead with that. But I'm like, no, absolutely not.
Mhm.
And that can feel like you're being a bit of a jerk, right? Because you're like, hey, I
Yeah.
should really sit down and do a 6-month deep dive with you. But you're really looking at, not just what do I understand? Because I've got, 3,500 screens I have to learn here really fast.
Yeah.
But so you have to do your diligence, of like, do I believe in the technical story he's telling? Do I believe in the engineering story he's telling? And do I believe in the user experience story he's telling? And then also I'm looking at how are the other people in the org believing them as
So
well.
that's super interesting to me. Like that specific, like, I mean, not conflict, but that back and forth. So like, how do you keep that point of view that you're forming? Like, how do you make sure that it's continued to get sharper and sharper and sharper, and that no one is leading the vision to becoming a Chimera or a Frankenstein? And that can be
Right.
one of your direct reports, but it can also be your business counterpart partner or your engineering counterpart partner. And because like in my experience working on vision exercises, like I'm doing a bunch on Facebook right now, it's easy to make concessions just so you can get halfway there, right? Like,
Mhm.
okay, we'll
Yeah.
make this yours and mine,
That's right.
But then but now we're doing two things when
Yeah.
really we should be doing one thing. How do you
Yeah.
prevent that vision from becoming blunt and non-focused when
Yeah.
working
Yeah.
with your partners and reports and everybody?
Yeah. Well, I talk about, this is where I think the business lens can be the most powerful one you have. Because business lens is where you start to talk about reality. That's all business is trying to do, is diligence. And like, we're going to do this thing, we're going to do that thing. We have this many devs, we have that many devs, and you start hacking at it from a different discipline, right? Because you can look at it as a designer and say, I know, I totally see where this is going. This is going into the sea of gray, and like these things are both going to be okay. And none of us came here to do things that are okay, right? And so you want to just say, just kill that thing. This is clearly like the awesome thing we should go with. That requires a huge amount of trust. The people have seen you make these judgment calls so many times. If you don't have that trust, you need to bring other things to bear. We'll talk about data, but that's kind of a cheap way to talk about it. It's more about like, hey, what's it really going to take to do this thing? What's it really going to take to do that thing? And how much do we really have to spend on it? And how much time do we really have? And what do we know happens to time when we're trying to do something great? Like you're running out all the time. So that's where I've really been happy in my investments. Again, my portfolio, like going back and doing business school, while I was managing a team at Nest, it was a completely insane thing to do. But it gave me a lot of these other tools, like how to really quickly whip together, a resource model or a business model in Excel. And suddenly you're talking to other people in the room about something other than the intuition of a designer. Right. So sometimes the way to get the design objective is to leave the design domain, use different language. And that's where that empathy for those other disciplines and the genuine curiosity about what they grapple with can really pay off for you. Because you can suddenly realize, oh, I know this engineering manager is short-staffed and he's really looking to dump one of these things. Let's talk about engineering resourcing instead of design objectives. So craft and code switching, right, in a very different way that we usually talk about it, but you're moving between different communities to bring different leverage points to get the right answer.
For folks that have been to several of these mentorship sessions, are you all noticing a theme here? Like for the past 4 or 5 calls that we've had, business is a constant theme, right? It's not just about coming up with perfect pixels. It's not just about doing enough research to make an argument, right? Like you have to be able to speak to the business angle. So thanks for pointing that out, Matt. Like I've been finding the same thing, that a lot of the best conversations that I've had in the past couple of years just come from being able, just speaking the same language. Because a lot of the time we as designers feel like, okay, I need to argue with you enough with the most perfect argument from a design angle, and then that's going to beat your argument coming from the product angle, and I'm going to win. But that's not how product gets built, right? Like both of those things need to come to the same level so that we can talk about, make a hypothetical example with PlayStation. Like should the future of the company be there is no hardware and there's an app, or should the future of the company be we're going to be a complete media center? It's not just about gaming anymore, right? That's a complete hypothetical thing. That's not what Matt.
Sure.
That's not what. I'm just saying, like having those hard conversations. You can't just do some mocks and be like, look at how badass it looks if we become a media center, right? So thank you for that. That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, and part of it is recognizing that these boundaries we create between disciplines are artificial, right? There are business people who design, there are designers who code, there are coders who do business, and people who merge more than one discipline start to realize these aren't two things. These are just lenses, and usually, like even within business, you've got 50 different POVs. So for folks who have kind of lit up, hey, business is kind of interesting, realize that you can learn business from your own perspective, right? And the nice thing about like an MBA program is it gives you, oh, here's 1 quarter in finance, but here's 1 quarter in business strategy, which, as it turns out, is a real thing that people do and specialize in. Sidebar, people should take strategy out of their job titles and off of their resume, because strategy has come to mean I'm fancy. And I've walked into so many sessions like, we're going to do some strategy now because I read this article on this 5-step process we're doing for strategy. Like, that ain't it. But back to this topic of business is also about, again, the disciplines and about language and the incredible power of language, and then the role that language plays in, you know, that's the most valuable thing I got out of business school as well, is a really different way to look at storytelling.
So can we get into process? So you come in, you see that there maybe is a legacy vision, and I mean, there's also the school of thought that a design vision similar to a business vision, like you're supposed to actually have a new 5-year vision every year, right? But like you come in and the last vision is collecting dust. Like what are the actual things that you do? Like what are the artifacts? What are the mechanisms that you create to start that process?
Yeah. So there's no one formula, but I can tell you my religion, which my religion is, hey, what all of us make on this call is code, right? That is our product. So we don't have to write code ourselves, thank God. But that's the final outcome. So if you imagine all these tributaries come into the code that is going to be written, right? And you need to be able to follow that story all the way down. But when we talk about vision, we're going up to the sources, all those little springs that are going to lead to this mighty river that you're hoping to ship, right? And it gets back to that prospecting sense of where's the work stream that I really need to tap into. Because again, it's not where can I inject vision, although that does come later in the process. It's about where can I harvest it. So I'm giving you a leadership perspective on it, but I think it's a useful one because you guys all know the individual perspective on it. But I always feel really nervous if we get too far into the talking and the decks and the meetings and the framing and the research before someone starts building something. And they're not building the final thing. They're building their first guess. From what we know now, this is what we would build. Because in today's world, it's faster to build it wrong, throw it away, and build it again than it is to figure out how to build it right before you start coding. So like get some code going. And now this can be interpreted, here's the wrong way to do that. The wrong way to do that is, hey, every programmer just start doing something. And they'll be off fixing bugs and stuff like that. You got to find the right people. You got to find the ones where you see a germ of a vision, or they've talked about one, or honestly, those folks who just don't wait for you to ask them and have just started to build something. I'm always looking for those folks. Here's that thing I did on the weekend. Here's that thing I did on the evening. And it's not, hey folks, when you hear this from your manager, it's not about slave driving and getting more hours of the day out of you. It's through the prospecting for passion, right? So you got to find, what are you passionate about and why? It might be because you're crazy, so I'm not going to get involved. But it might be like, hey, you're probably really smart because you're at this company and there are a lot of interesting problems. I think you've got an interesting problem and I think you're attacking it in an interesting way. What code are you building? Because some of these key prototypes become seed crystals that the whole program forms around.
I like that a lot, because it's like the product is a bucket, and you're saying that, like, don't be overly eager to put more in the bucket. Take stuff out, because it's hard enough to just do that. No is probably the most precious resource in the design world. The ability to say no, the political capital that's necessary to say no, the perspective to say what to say no to. But if you're in an environment where people are not saying no very much, you're not leading towards, again, you're trending towards the gray. But anyway, the prototype stream has to get going. There are 3 things if you want to convince management to do something. 3 things you can show them. One is tons of data. Everyone does that. We've both been at Facebook. You're at Facebook now. Data all over the place. It's amazing, the quantity and quality of data there. That's great. Second is customer verbatims. It's like, hey, you watched this person use your shit and, pardon me, they didn't like it. You watched them not like it and you realized that they were a reasonable person not liking your stuff. So verbatim, direct experience of the customer, that's the second thing you can bring to management. Third thing, badass prototype, right? Put it in their hand them the phone, say, I'm not going to talk, just use it. Most powerful agent for change in any corporate tech environment. So super, super, super critical. So that's kind of artifact part of it. And then the other is this is kind of sound boring, but maybe I can tie it a little bit to what went on in PS5 to spice it up. It's prioritization. It's relentless, because you can't get to no's unless you get to prioritization. And then the core thing for prioritization for a big program like PS5, I can tell you, I was 2 weeks in
year and a half before launch. I had just started. I honestly did not know anything. I had seen some of the screens where they were in development. Mostly I was just meeting people. But, I sent out, a pretty long memo to my team saying, this is awesome, all the typical rah-rah stuff that you get from executive. But one thing that was really, really important for me to do in that memo was to pick a couple favorites, and I don't mean people, although that did happen too, sidebar. But I said, hey, the two important things about what we're doing here on the PS5, from my perspective, these are not priorities I found from a list, are the SSD, now obvious to us, and activity cards. So these are the cards that go into the control center. I won't go into huge detail about them, but activity cards turn games inside out. And they basically say, we're gonna take all the things that are inside the game, publish them out to the operating system so it can start surfacing these little snippets of gameplay. I'm like, this is the most innovative thing we're doing here. If we win at it, it's gonna be transformative for the generation. Now, big risk of getting these things wrong. But as a leader, it's like, critical that I do this. I take a stand. I have to say what I believe, and I have to say it really fast because there's not a lot of time. The team's like, hey, you have to get this all put together, and get it out the door. It's really coming in there to ship. Critical to the, brutal almost prioritization, critical to the innovation process. Another way that same kind of beneficent brutality comes up. One of the teams that I've worked in Microsoft, actually the team I've just rejoined, one of the things we do is a quarterly innovation cycle. This was in the previous generation terminology, is all different now. But this would be, a lot of brainstorming and stuff like that. But the important thing about it was, to put it in a really reductive context where you're voting after each session and throwing away half the ideas, huge volume of ideas, all that double diamond stuff we know about from design thinking. I won't go into, it's all mostly true. But prototyping, there's nothing more important than that. There's nothing more important than no in the process of crystallizing a vision. And you can't go anywhere unless your leaders are willing to take strong opinions about controversial topics.
And I think that we're going to make this the last one and then get into Q&A. Like you've crystallized it. Congratulations, right? Like largely the business and design is aligned on where you're going. You've still got an entire engineering org that's skeptical though. How do you actually execute on a vision? So it's like, okay, you've got a temporary moment in time when everyone's heads are nodding, and we both know that that's it's a brief amount of time that you have when people are like, yeah, this sounds about right. Now, how do you transition that into execution?
Yeah, so often what's going on, you have 3,000 engineers, 100 something designers, about as many PMs floating around. The problem is less about we don't believe it and more about we don't understand what the heck you're talking about. I'm doing this piece you told me. I don't see how this is going to fit together, but I'll just keep going based on faith. That can be good enough to get you through some stuff, but it doesn't give you the conviction to get people to really grind into the details and get them right. And so a lot of it, the artifacts that are happening mid-cycle, I'll talk about one that we spent probably, I had a whole team of people building this out. These were basically final 6 months before launch. Almost nothing's working, as it is in every tech product I've ever worked on. I don't mean that in a bad way. I think generally engineering was incredibly good over the course of PS5. But lots of stuff that just wasn't connected yet, and you couldn't see it, and people are like, I think it's going to be okay, but I'm worried, and people are starting to check the doors and stuff like that. And so we actually put teams together going over the thousands and thousands of wireframes and mocks and out of date documents around. And we identified 60 key flows through the experience. And what we did is we said, here's exactly what this flow is going to be. And it was only 2 months away that you were going to be able to see this in the builds. But these were two of the most critical months of the development. Everyone was ready to jump off the roof. They had been locked up under COVID conditions, doing remote QA and all this kind of stuff. And so it's telling the story, keep telling the story, never assume that when people are disagreeing that they actually are disagreeing with what you're saying. They're often disagreeing with what they thought you said, so it was really super late. It's just an example of storytelling, but it was super late that we were going into final design reviews, and we were able to digitally hand out to all the executives in these really critical sign-off meetings where we were killing massive features in every one of these sessions. I was giving them storyboards. Here's the perfect version of what you're about to see, because what you're about to see is going to have, this data layer is not provisioned yet. We haven't got this animation working right. So even though from one perspective, it was a total waste of work because all these designs were in effect, they were already handed off, but no one, we couldn't see it in the product yet, all put together. So we created these interim artifacts to arm particularly the executives, because they're the one who would be making these tough calls. Make sure you know exactly what you're seeing because you won't be able to tell it all from the screen. I think that was one of the most critical things we did among millions of critical things. And I want to be super specific. I was not the most important person in the design org. I had a particular role, which is I need to ship this thing and I need to help the right cuts happen and all that kind of stuff. But it's almost like a Tai Chi thing. I'm channeling energy, and I'm amplifying it, but it's not about me. That's really, really important for me as a leader.
So it sounds like what I got out of that is, the vision is going to break down into a lot of pieces, and a lot of the time, the engineers, by the time they get it, they only see their piece. Mm-hmm. So make sure that there's enough visibility across the organization to see what is the point of this and how does it all come together. And it's not necessarily going to be production ready design, but it's going to get everyone in the same narrative of like, oh, okay, this is how this specific module that I'm working on goes into this section of the app. And this is how this section of the app is just one piece of the puzzle of this larger overhaul we're doing for the entire program.
Yeah. And it lets people see things like, oh my God, there's all this gorgeous animation happening on the screen before mine. And here I'm trying to get off without doing that. But I mean, a really important thing to recognize is with a program like PS5 that's in development for 2 years, certainly started before I got there. In those crucial months before launch, the rate of decisions is getting faster and faster. Yeah. The decisions are getting harder and harder because there are more and more brutal cuts to the product. And really important thing, they tend to get dumber and dumber, right? Because you're making them faster and faster with less. So like educating the executives, here's what we're shipping, here's why this fits in. And the way we found to do it was like, we're just going to draw this whole flow for you. So they're like, the amazing thing that happens is when you're reviewing a piece of code that's not quite done yet, that the executives can flip back and forth and say, oh no, we didn't mean to leave this big stupid thing here. Let's not talk about that in the room. You can see from your storyboards that that's not going to be in the product. So yeah, crystallizing communication and just an understanding of what the heck you're shipping is actually kind of underrated.
So I'd love to touch on that for 1 second. It's just like, be prepared as a designer. So I'm going to bring it back to the IC. Right, like you're driving these big vision conversations and also trying to figure out like how would we actually execute on this thing. Make sure that you're ready to defend every single point of that design. I remember going through. I mean, it was kind of brutal, but also really fun. A sign-off meeting with an executive where we sat down. In addition to the deck, at Amazon we always print out everything that we're doing. So he also had pages for everything that I presented. And he just took a red Sharpie and just started crossing stuff out, right? And he would ask questions before crossing it out, but a lot of things I just wasn't able to defend because I was going, well, what do you mean? Like, we need a delete button. Like, you can't not have a delete button. And it was like, that's not a good enough reason to cut, right? Like, and that should come out of the alignment with your organization, right? By the time you do get to the point where that's crystallized, right, you have to have really good conviction and you have to have rationale behind every decision inside of that deck. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm gonna call it there. I could do this all day, but I want to tee us up for Q&A. Okay, so this is a good question. So where do you start learning about one of the three things that you talked about was the technology, right? So like, where do you start learning about the technology and code to get comfortable level of having a conversation with product stakeholder or engineering manager or whatever? And I think this person's also saying without learning how to code.
Right. Yeah, totally. So really what you want to understand is, and I'll wax poetic here, is, code is a magical substance. We've never seen it before. So if you work in design, we have color, we have form, we have motion, we have meaning. Code is a new thing on the palette. And you don't need to be a specialist in code at all, but to have kind of what is this stuff? That's what you want to get to. Because when you start to understand what this stuff is, A, it's less intimidating. B, you start to understand where some programmers' questions come from. C, you start to understand like what things you might bring up quicker to like make sure that you're aligned with your engineering partners or with your senior managers about the reality of this thing. So I'd say take almost any coding class. Just take the class, but don't take it with this mentality of I have to win. Take it with a sense of curiosity. And so I think it's also good to take a coding class that's oriented towards your interests. Like some will be like, like here's how to factor primes. It's like, I don't care about primes or how to factor them. So that's not interesting to me. So it's gonna be really hard to wade through that class. I think one of the most interesting design code intersections happening today is Swift UI. So basically, Apple has taken their mainstream hardcore programming language, Swift, which is also like one of the easiest languages to use I've ever seen, and made it more design specific. So made it more fun for designers to work with and play with. So I would go look for a class around there. Because honestly, like if you're doing it right, it should make you more curious. But you don't really want to become a programmer because that's a different thing from being a designer.
Yeah.
So it's not about changing your career. It's about understanding what the modern age of design is really about, which is about code.
Love it. I'm looking here. Do you think so you mentioned how being a strategist is just the word strategy is just another word for fancy. What do you think of the word strategist as a title? And it sounds like it's as a self-declared title.
Career suicide, personally. And that's overstating it because I'm a poet. But it doesn't really mean anything. And so it's really just saying I'm a designer, but at a transcendent kind of level. I'm a design strategist. What you're often saying, which you probably don't want to be saying, is that stuff about like drawing stuff in Figma, like that's kind of beneath me. I work at a higher level. It's like, okay, great. So you're not a designer. What are you then? So you really want to be proud about that craft level and like really hit there hard. It's not to say that you don't do like strategic tools, and there's a lot of, I won't even get into the topic of what's a good strategic tool. A couple things I'll talk about strategies. One, I was lucky enough to stumble into a strategy class at UC Berkeley taught by the only person I've ever heard speak about strategy in a compelling way. And the amazing thing about this guy is, he's business strategy, right? He could crunch numbers like nobody's business. And then he also really knew when to shut the heck up about numbers and flip over and start talking about what the heck should we do? And so it's that marrying of like, I can just drill in and really understand the fundamental reality of what's happening here, and then I can turn it into action. But really what we're also talking about with action is long-term action, because we all want to know what the next thing we should do is. We just don't know what's the thing we're not ready for that's going to hit us in a year. And in that kind of strategy work, I think one of the most important tests when you get sucked into these strategy sessions at work or whatnot like that, good strategy is controversial, right? If someone busts out their strategies, they do over and over again. It's like, here's the 5 key points, win the market, be amazing, whatever. It's like, it's just a Hallmark card, right? What makes it strategy is like, whoa, point 3, like sounds, I don't agree with that. That sounds really stupid. Tell me why we should do that. And then the explanation you have for why we should do that. But if you don't get that WTF moment from some of your audience, you're not doing strategy. You're just kind of restating the obvious, and generally everyone's waiting for you to get to the designs. Sorry to be, too harsh about that, but I would it's become a really kind of foul term, particularly at the design strategist level.
It's really something that you want to have running in parallel with what you're already doing, right? It shouldn't take over what you're doing completely. So like every designer on this call, like you need to have a strategy layer. And I chalk vision as one of the tools that I use inside of my strategy layer, right? Like where it's like, there's the day-to-day work and there's the stuff that I'm expected to do. And there's the stuff that like absolutely can't lose momentum. And I think that that's where a lot of strategists get caught up, is they allow their higher level thinking to choke up what is supposed to be generating momentum inside of the company. So like so don't let that side of the coin take over the other one. Like you need to be running both at the same time.
Absolutely true. Yeah. Well, I say,
and the flip is also a lot of time the flip can screw people too, right? Because a lot of the time, like after you've been doing long enough, like you're expected to have that strategic layer, but you're resisting because you just want to make prototypes in Figma, and you don't want to think beyond just like, drawing stuff. Like you also have to exercise that layer at a certain point. Like if you want to keep moving forward in your career, you need to build a point of view. right? And that's going to be done away from the pixels.
I'll talk about a super tactical thing that I think might be illustrative for folks, because I do believe deeply in strategy. I just don't like to talk about it because I think there's a lot of bad talk about it. But one of the things that we did for PS5 a month before launch was, we were generally been obsessing with, build quality and inspecting pixels, make sure animations were coming in right. And that was the right thing to do. But I'm also like, hey, we're going to ship, and then we're going to be like, what are we doing now? People are going to jump into that vacuum with all sorts of motivations. And so I'm like, I want to hear from the team. What do you think we should do after ship? So I basically asked everybody in the entire design org to give, in rough terms, what are the top 5 things we should do, and what are the top 5 things that we should not do, we should cut or shut down. Really important for me that every single person in the organization, I know I'm yelling at them for those mocks that are due on Monday. It doesn't mean don't think about next year. And in fact, and so part of it was a signal to the team. It's like, hey, as soon as, we get this incredible mountain off our backs with launching, then the real climb starts with, where are we going with this? And that's something that I think everybody in the org is responsible for, having a vision and a strategy, but they don't necessarily need to do a deck about it.
And how do you scope that? So like, as you go through that crystallization process, like certain things are going to be achievable within launch and certain things are going to be post launch, but you also talked a lot about just like cutting features, right? So yeah. How do you scope it? This is coming from Brahma. Thank you for the question. How do you scope it so you know what's within launch and what's not?
Yeah, it's an iterative process. I mean, we do the best we can with, developer estimates, and designer estimates, which I think are something that the design org should be taking seriously. Is like, do you give work estimates, on design tickets, or however you manage it in your organization? But there's the obvious scoping stuff we know. But I think one good thing to just have in the back of your mind always is cutting is good. Cutting is really good. And the earlier you cut, the better what's left gets. So it's not like what fits in the time we have remaining, because whatever answer you come up with is not going to fit in the time remaining. Right? Yeah, so it's kind of knowing that you're never going to reach the right scope. You're always going to, and you don't want to, because that's just going to get you down to like a minimalist kind of just get it done product. You want that ambition bubbling around the edges. It's a sign of health and what's going on. But to me, a lot of, there's the bottom up thing where we do dev hours, and the top down thing is just cut everything you can see that isn't nailed down, but have people with good judgment doing it. That's the trick.
And one other thing I would add to that is it's critical that you are partnered, not just like telling, but partnered with engineering on this, because a lot of the time what will happen is the things that will get you to that vision that you're so passionate about, there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be layered. So like sometimes the first and kind of like monumental huge win that you can get, you won't even see because it's not going to manifest in the UI. But like the stack underneath it will have completely been transformed, and now it's actually able to change into what you're trying to get it to be in 3 years. So like for scope, sometimes it means that the scope for the short term is just making sure that you're crystal clear, like Matt said, on the code. What needs to fundamentally change on the product right, at a infrastructure level to even have these crazy conversations, right? And now what you're doing is, instead of pitching them that really cool transition or moving from one menu style to another menu style, you're pitching the tech. Like, hey, we need to move to this like infrastructure layer design, and you're rallying design and you're rallying product to talk about this engineering concept, right? Can you imagine what a breath of fresh air that would be for your engineering organization if their product and design organizations were talking about an engineering concept and championing it, right? But but you've identified that via that scoping exercise as like, that's the first thing that needs to get done for me to get over here, right? So that's a hard thing to do, but sometimes I guess that's a rambly way of saying that sometimes the most immediate thing in scoping is you need to know what needs to happen on the ground. And that's the people actually doing the code.
And you touched on one of my favorite topics, which is just to jump in on, oh my gosh, we're at 10. But let me just hit this one. Is that relationship with engineers? Realize that design is not something that's only happening in the design org. Decisions are being made everywhere that are going to affect what that experience is that comes out the other end. And rather than fighting to get people to do your thing at the end of your design process, get them in early, bring them into your design sprints. You know, you're going to find creative minds to work with on the engineering side. When you do that, they have a shared sense of ownership. So when it comes to the tough calls later on, they're going to make them with you. Yeah. We want to do one last question on the margin here.
I can go a little over. So ultimately, I just want to be sensitive to your time. Like if you're still excited, we can take maybe 2 more questions and then call it at that.
Deal. You got it.
Cool. I think I love this one. So, and I'm going to paraphrase for Tony here, but how can you start doing all this as a junior, right? So like, how can you start pushing vision and some of these like higher level concepts if you're a junior UXer with limited experience?
Yeah. There's no 2 ways about it, right? When I got to Apple, so I was 22, 1988, mind blown. Mac had come out 4 years earlier. The world had changed. I came in and I did the job that they asked me to do for the first 8 hours. And then as soon as that clock ticked over, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's all this cool stuff happening here. I'm going to go look at all of it. And I'm finding these prototypes of early versions of Mac OS, betas of Photoshop, you know, crazy stuff, you know. And so I was really, so you cannot avoid the hours, right? Use the time when you don't have kids or don't have too many kids. You won't believe the pressures that will come later in life. And you really got to be hardcore entrepreneurial. You're doing the job you have during the day and you're doing the job you want during the evenings. And what has to come out of that is you got to make stuff and you got to make really cool stuff. And hopefully that stuff is closely related to your day job. That's always been the key for me. But to be that, you know, kind of crazy guy who's just going a little too deep into everything and like getting really keyed up, you be that guy or that gal. There's no substitute for personal passion. It's the thing that every manager you will ever come across is really, really looking for. Best way to show it is those advanced artifacts. But all the time when I'm doing portfolio reviews with people, I'm like, hey, you've been stuck doing, you know, designing receipts for cash registers. Go redesign Facebook. Put that in your portfolio as well as a passion project.
Just do it. You don't need the job to do it. Just go do it.
Yeah, just go do it.
Yeah, I talk about this all the time as well. It's just like make sure that you're not spending 90% of your energy applying for jobs, right? Yeah. And this doesn't matter if you're in the beginning of your career or you're frustrated in the middle of it or you're like at any point in your career life. 90% of your anxiety should never be in applying for jobs. It should be in just doing stuff. Do work. The more of a body of work you have, the more opportunity you'll get for being organically discovered, and the more you will actually deserve the work that you want. Yeah. And we'll call this the last question. And this is maybe a little away from the vision stuff, but I'm curious myself. Do you have any sage advice for new managers that have recently transitioned from IC?
This is going to be really tactical stuff. Personally, the way I run it, up to 10 people, I should keep my hands dirty. Past 10 people, I should absolutely not have my hands dirty. I need to really focus on empowering the people who are on my team to move forward. Below 10 people, it's too early to let yourself get sucked away from the work too much. And also realize you'll always be pulled up into pure administrative management work. Sometimes that can go up to with a lot of money too, as well. But it will take up all of your time and then some. So really realize you can calibrate how big of a team you want to run. You can get some really powerful leadership happening with a very small team because you're in a very privileged space where you can stay intimately familiar with the details of what's going on. Once you go up to your manager of managers, you're not a designer anymore. And you will cling to that. This is why I do creative work on the weekends, because I have to keep an eye, even if you know I'm rustier than the people who are doing the tactical work. But you really want to be deliberate about that stuff. And also really realize that companies are profoundly different in how much they will pay you. I'll be totally blunt about it while being an IC. And the best companies, and I've tried to put this into place at several companies I've worked at successfully, and a couple of them, you should be able to be the level of a VP in comp as an IC. There might only be one person in the company who's at that level, but if you're really at a company that thinks that the only way to progress is management, that's a good reason to make a career change or a company change.
And I think any company using StrengthsFinder as a template has a high chance of doing things right. Just coming from Gallup's school of thought, right?
Interesting.
So I appreciate that. Okay, I think as much as I could easily go another hour doing this, this has been a lot of fun. Matt, I want to be sensitive to your time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone that's joined the call, on the email that you got, right? Like there's that originally had Matt's bio. There's a link to his LinkedIn. Also, on the email itself, you can click on Matt's name, go to his LinkedIn, shoot him a message, shoot him a thank you. Let him know specifically what you got out of that out of this session. It'll mean a lot to me if he feels really good about giving back to you all. Thank you so much for joining me on a Friday morning, and yeah, we'll see you all next month. I hope you guys got a lot out of this, and again, Matt, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for putting this together. It's been fantastic.